Welcome to the College Football Survivor Show, where playoff survival is always on the line. Here's Shehan J. Haraja and Bobak Hayeri.
Hey everybody, it's the College Football Survivor Show. I'm Bobak Hayeri with my co-host Shehan J. Haraja, national college football writer for CBS Sports. We are glad to have you with us, and we're between Week 0 and Week 1. We were served appetizers with an Irish amuse-bouche last weekend, and this week we begin the feast starting on Thursday as a fantastic slate of games will take us all the way till Monday night when Boston College tries to see if they can really put Florida State's season into a tizzy or if the Noles can kind of bounce back. But with this full week ahead of us, in today's episode, we're going to take a second to talk about 10 things we are looking forward to this 2024 college football season. Before we dive in, though, let me remind you, you can find us on X and TikTok at CFB Survivor Show, where we have video highlights of the show, run polls, and listen to your feedback. Take a moment if you can to like, rate, and subscribe to us wherever you get your shows. We appreciate that, and we always appreciate you. But, man, I'm looking forward to this. Like, again, we talked about it in the last episode. That was a great start to a season. I don't even know what we call Week 0 now. It's kind of getting bigger and bigger. But tell us about this show. This is an opportunity to talk about the things that have got our eye.
Yeah, well, I think for me, I mean, look, we're about to head into Week 1. The season is here, and we're all primed up. We've talked about the playoff contenders. We've set the table in so many ways. And now I think, especially heading into Week 1, like, I just want to know what you're excited about, right? Like, I want to know what to keep an eye on this season. I want to know, how should I contextualize what's about to happen heading into 2024? First of all, with just the legitimate competition, that's going to be a lot of fun. And also, by the way, you can add to it all the changes that are coming to college football as well. So I'm excited for this season. I'm excited for this show, and I think I'm ready to go.
Absolutely. So let's kick us off here. What is, some of these are going to be a bit of a mix of macro level stuff and some of the more specific to some of the team storylines we've been looking at. But kick us off here. What is one of the 10 things that you're looking forward to this season?
Yeah, I'm going to start with a small picture. We have lots of big picture. We have lots of small picture. But I'm going to start with a particular unit, a particular team, one actually that we will see this weekend play in a big game. I'm just so fascinated to see Miami's offense get to play with each other. We've been talking about this all offseason, but this is one of the most fun offenses in college football. Cameron Ward coming over from Washington State. He's been a big-time player for them. Damian Martinez at running back, a former 1,000-yard rusher at Oregon State, who in so many ways helped key the last 2 years of success at Oregon State. Then Xavier Restrepo at receiver as a returner, but he teams up now with Samuel Brown at wide receiver as well, coming over from Houston. This is a stacked offense, and their offensive line, too, should also be pretty good. They opened the season against Florida, and, I mean, like, I want to see it all come together. I want to see them have a big year. You know, I think that they took some nice steps on offense in 2023 under first-year coordinator Shannon Dawson. This is year 2. He's going to have a lot more talent than he had to work with in 2023. I'm endlessly fascinated to see, is this a unit that could be one of the best in the entire country?
I think that's a great way to start out. I love the fact that this game against Florida, whoever loses is going to have a fan base completely on fire for various reasons. I mean, this may be the most loaded game in terms of stress levels between those two programs. I mean, you could probably produce a diamond from what's going on over there. It's almost a shame, frankly. I mean, it's got a good slot. It's at the 3:30 p.m. ABC slot nationally. But at the same time, I think I kind of would have loved that to be the Monday night game or the Sunday night game, just like a game where everyone has to watch. Really just crank up that pressure a notch. I mean, all respect to USC, LSU, and BC, Florida State. This would have been one that would have been absolutely must-see TV for a lot of fans who might be neutral and just curious to see which team has got it going. And my goodness, I mean, when you look at, you put it so well. I mean, we saw what happens when talent does not quite come together, despite all the names involved, despite a history of taking great teams and great players and putting them together. And with Florida State, even a previous season that had gone other than, we've much talked about how it ended, but I mean, to put together the season they did and then watch how it doesn't quite click, at the very least, at the beginning of the season. So will Miami have a bit of that? Will we see Cameron Ward, Damian Martinez, will we see them be a well-integrated part of this machine, this offense that everyone's talking about? And, of course, can Mario Cristobal coach his way through this game and not accidentally not have some fiasco at the end? Could you imagine that? Can you imagine if Miami actually looks excellent, but then Florida rises up and then just some coaching fiasco at the end? I mean, there's so many ways this could go wrong for either team that you can't look away. You absolutely can't look away. This is going to be a glorious game. I love that as a starter.
And I will say, I feel like both of us actually picked Miami to win the ACC and make the college football playoff. They're going to lose one. That's just so dumb. They're going to lose one game. That's so dumb this year. I cannot wait to see which game it is. It won't be a game. I think they're going to win all their big games. I think they're going to beat Florida State. I think they're going to go on the road against Louisville, beat Virginia Tech. I think they beat Florida this week. They're going to go to Cal or something and just do something so insane because their body clocks are going to be all confused. They're going to be playing in the Bay Area. It's going to be crazy. This will happen at some point. I just think that Miami still is going to be good enough to make it through at 11-2 and win the ACC.
Hey, at the very least, though, if you're playing at Cal, the environment isn't going to be a factor. I'm not saying the fans. I'm just saying, it's not going to be intense heat, intense cold. It's just going to be it's actually kind of nice out here.
It'll be too nice. They'll be like, "Whew, I just want to hang out over here. I want to go to I want to go to the pier. I don't want to be out here in Berkeley at a football stadium. This sucks. Let me get a burrito. That's what I want. I don't want to be playing football out here."
Exactly, man. The Mission District, that's where the Mission Burrito, a.k.a. the Chipotle Burrito for most of you out there, that's where it was invented, all right. I love it. Oh, my goodness. Well, I'm going to go to another team, I think, just kind of go with this team that is absolutely loaded, but can it work? Because so much ever since the national championship was won by their rival, Ohio State took over the offseason. I mean, won the January Heisman or whatever you want, the February national championship, however you want to phrase it, by just putting together an incredible group of parts. I mean, they swapped out, maybe an equal, we'll see, but Kyle McCord for Will Howard, but then they brought Caleb Downs, Quinshon Judkins, which really was where did that come from? Seth McLaughlin, Julian Sayin, just a team that was already loaded with talent, got bigger. And then Chip Kelly leaves UCLA to be their offensive coordinator and work with the guy he had worked with back in New Hampshire and Ryan Day. The schedule isn't too bad. They have a fairly cakewalk non-conference. They've got a game at Oregon that obviously we've talked about quite a bit. They've got that game at Penn State, and then, of course, the rivalry game. But all of that said, superstar team, this is going to be it. But sometimes you take lots of little parts and put it together, and it doesn't end up coalescing. We talked about that with Florida State. Of course, Ohio State does not start with a team with a veteran offensive line, at least at their level, because they start with some MAC programs. That could be good. I mean, but it's still a MAC program. We're going to pencil in those losses. I don't even know. Have they ever? I mean, I can't remember this piece of trivia, but I don't know if Ohio State's ever lost to another team recently in its own state. I don't know if it has done that. But all of that said, we saw what happened with Florida State. It can potentially not come together in the long run. And we've seen other teams too that without the transfer portal, everyone remembers that if you're older, that Matt Barkley USC team that was coming back. Oh, they're going to run through the season. And then they kind of limped into the Sun Bowl and did not know how to stop Georgia Tech. And they lost that as well. So sometimes these things don't work out. And will these parts come together and create an Ohio State super team or an Ohio State Frankenstein, because sometimes all these parts create something strange, to say nothing about, I can't even imagine the skill it takes to manage the egos on a program like Ohio State right now, because these are all a bunch of guys who knew they were stars. I mean, Caleb Downs already knew he was a star. Quinshon Judkins, I mean, they were shocked he left. So there's so many ways this could also go south that I'm curious to see how it all comes together. And if it gets a hiccup, because, I mean, it'll be fascinating too. I mean, there's so many different spots where it could start to come loose. Actually, and I love it. Our good producer Joey just gave me the trivia answer. Ohio State has not lost to another Ohio school since 1921, and I do appreciate this. It is Oberlin, which I think still plays at D3. There's even an Oberlin in Japan, which plays college football, which is, of course, totally my nerd zone coming out there. But
nobody's thinking that. I want to be clear.
Yeah, it wasn't the one in Japan. It was the one in Ohio. Yeah. But all I have to say is, can it come together? What do you think, Sean? Do you think, I mean, am I being too worried here, or did Florida State kind of give us a hint that be careful? Sometimes things cannot work out.
Well, look, Oberlin is not walking through that door to Ohio Stadium. I did look. I think that Ohio State is 34-0 all time against MAC opponents. I believe that stat is the most updated one. So I don't think they've ever lost to a MAC team. Like you said, you have to go back to 1921 when I think the game was a little different back then, but I don't know. I'm no expert.
Yeah, I mean, the MAC, I think, was founded in the 1940s, so that's safely to say that never happened.
Well, an extremely quick aside, Oklahoma and Temple are playing on Friday, and I had to write like our pregame pick story for that game. I found a New York Times clipping from the last time that these two teams played. It was 1942, and the entire second paragraph was about how far the punter kicked. And oh, by the way, they forgot to mention he also had a game-winning pick six. But they talked about his punting for an entire paragraph before they talked about him. Anyway, Temple actually
punting is winning. Punting is winning. It's the Iowa motto there.
I love it. Anyway, back to our actual point. This is such a fascinating team because I'm trying to think. I mean, Michigan last year would potentially be a little like this, but I'm trying to think in the playoff era, what teams have had the most pressure to win a national championship heading into a season? Like 2023, Michigan is definitely one of them, just with how much they put on themselves and the way they protected that season. But I'm trying to think back, like, there was pressure on 2015 Ohio State because people felt like this was the best team in the country because they had just won the title with a number of underclassmen players like Ezekiel Elliott and Joey Bosa. But I don't know that there's been another team because, like, 2016 Clemson, I think, had some pressure to win, but nobody would have been like, well, Clemson didn't win a title. Like, nobody would have been like that, right? I think that Georgia was under a little bit of pressure to win just ever, right? Like to get past and get over the hump. But I don't think that anybody entered 2021 being like, ooh, if Georgia doesn't do it, they're in big trouble. This Ohio State team, I think, is going to have a unique level of pressure on it because of the amount of money that's been put into the roster. Like, their AD is bragging about spending $20 million on the football team this year. That's nuts. The athletic director is bragging about this. And of course, just when you look at the context of losing 3 straight against Michigan, not being in the Big Ten title game, not winning the Big Ten in a non-COVID year since 2019, not winning a playoff game in a non-COVID year under Ryan Day, there's just so much going into this year. And I'm just fascinated and frankly really excited to see how they deal with all that pressure.
Absolutely. So where do you want to take us next? Should we keep kind of looking a little bit more narrower, or should we go a little broader?
I'll take us to a broad question. I'm curious, right? After last season, 6 quarterbacks were picked in the top 12 of the NFL draft. And I think, one, that's a testament to the number of quarterbacks coming out of from the 2023 season and how good a quarterback year that we had. Caleb Williams, Michael Penix, Bo Nix, J.J. McCarthy, like so many good players, not even counting the Heisman winner Jaden Daniels, not even counting the number 3 overall pick Drake May. We're rebuilding at that position this year. I think it's fair to say. Part of the reason I think that so many quarterbacks were picked in the top 12, and by the way, outside of J.J. McCarthy, who of course suffered an MCL injury and would have been the starting quarterback, I think that Penix is the only other one who won't be the starting quarterback for his team, which is kind of crazy for 6 quarterbacks to be picked in the top 12 and 5 of them potentially on track to start as rookies. The other, again, Penix, we knew was going to be behind Kirk Cousins heading into the season. But I think this is also a statement in some ways about the perceived lack of talent at the top of the 2025 draft. You have some good players, right? Carson Beck, Quinn Ewers, of course, a good player. Shedeur Sanders, a very legitimate, I think, NFL draft prospect. But I'm curious, who is that next guy who's going to step up in maybe the way that you look at Jaden Daniels, who is not seen as a top 5 draft prospect heading into 2023? I'm curious who that guy is going to be this season, because I think there's a true power vacuum at the position, especially from an NFL draft perspective heading into the year.
Yeah, because and again, as you pointed out, some of those big names, also maybe Dylan Gabriel, we could throw him out there for the Ducks. But will we see someone maybe rise out from that, I don't want to call it second tier, but from people we weren't necessarily thinking of quite as prominently, or maybe someone on a team that is balanced and we think is going to make that CFP run, or at least have a very strong chance, like a Jackson Dart, Jalen Milroe. I mean, obviously he was a finalist. Can he step up? And that might go into one of the questions I have kind of coming up here. Can Noah Fafita kind of, again, tighten it up? Of course, it's a new coaching staff there. Can Garrett Green just suddenly turn it on at West Virginia? Brady Cook is another one I was thinking of. It's kind of funny. Or will we see someone, because I love the fact that sometimes we'll see someone rise up from the G5. I mean, it's one of those things. I don't know if, because Caden Salter, we've talked a lot about him. Will we see someone like a Seth Hennigan, a Byron Brown, Jordan McLeod, maybe as he gets over to Texas State? Will we see one of those guys kind of elevate their game to the point where, especially the G5 level, you start to see a team make a real run? I mean, my favorite moment, and I guess I'll credit Mikey Keene because he's currently the quarterback for Fresno State, but I still remember when Fresno State went on that little Cinderella run in 2001, all because they had a guy from Bakersfield who knew how to chuck the ball. And he, by the way, I have to say, I'm not going to name names here, only of the other guy, but my high school, the one kid who went on to play D1 off, or actually went to that same Fresno State squad, same class. And he was the lead. He was the presumed replacement. And then he got in the coach's Pat Hill's doghouse, and suddenly the other kid gets the start. Whoops! You get a number 1 NFL draft pick. So sometimes that's sometimes how it goes. It's sometimes how it goes. But yeah.
I'm curious. So, you mentioned some of those guys. I'm fascinated to see how NFL talent evaluators view Caden Salter at Liberty, because in both good and bad ways, he has a lot of, and the comparison's a little lazy, but he has a lot of Malik Willis to his game, right? What he's able to do with his legs, what he's able to do with his arm. I love the accuracy that he's shown. I love the ability to avoid mistakes. He had a 32-6 touchdown to interception ratio last year. And look, they obviously got flattened by Oregon, but you also saw him do some stuff in that game that were interesting against a team that, frankly, they had no business competing against, right? So it's going to be really, really interesting to see. I think Caden Salter would be a name that I'd think of to rise up the board. The issue with both Fafita and Garrett Green for me as NFL guys specifically is that they're both really small. Like, they're both really, really small. I don't know how NFL talent evaluators are going to look at that, especially since both have good arms, but I don't think either has like Kyler Murray has a crazy arm, right? For the size that he is. I think that might be a slight issue for them. I mean, frankly, Cam Ward could really help himself with a good 2024 because he's got the goods. I think it's really going to be more about having some good tape whenever he enters that process more than any of the physical stuff. But I'm fascinated to see. I think there's a really
one name I wanted to toss in. One more name I wanted to toss in. If Andy Kotelnicki really does get a chance to do what he can, Drew Aller could suddenly be in the picture. Because wouldn't that be a change?
On this bandwagon, and I do not understand it. So Andy Kotelnicki, you look back at his career, and by the way, this is a situation that I think could definitely be on one of our 2 lists. But he makes hay with mobile quarterbacks, right? Jalen Daniels, Jason Bean, Tyree Jackson, even down to Wisconsin Whitewater. Like, he makes things happen with mobile quarterbacks, and Drew Aller is not a mobile quarterback. Now, I think also Andy Kotelnicki's really good at his job, so maybe it's all right.
That's what I gotta say. Like, give the man credit; he can coach.
It'll be interesting. It'll be interesting. I mean, talent-wise, there's no question. I've said before, I can't remember if I've said on this podcast, because I've said it on other podcasts. The thing I want to see this weekend from Drew Aller is I want to see Drew Aller like cock back and launch a bomb down the field that turns into a terrible interception at West Virginia and like just come back and do it again. Like I want to see him do something dumb, make a mistake, and grow from it instead of be afraid to make a mistake. That would be a successful first game for me.
Well, I'll tell you what, our Mountaineer listeners are definitely a fan of the first part of that. In fact, they'd like that to keep repeating itself for the game. Maybe a couple pick sixes, a fumble in the end zone. They'd love that. I'm going to just follow up on this one with a little bit more specific, but I'm very, very curious to see what Kalen DeBoer can get out of Jalen Milroe, because we have seen Kalen DeBoer can develop quarterbacks, at every stop he's been at. Obviously, he's been a successful head coach on many different levels, but we've seen especially what he got out of Michael Penix at Washington. And now to get the keys to Jalen Milroe and the rest of the Alabama talent base, but particularly Milroe, can he refine that game? Can he help him take that next step up? Because Milroe was looking pretty good at the end of last season. I mean, again, unfortunately for some fans, maybe the last thing they remember is the end of the Rose Bowl, which I thought was a little unfair because that was just the snapping was a little bit of a question. It just seemed a little bit of miscommunication. Guys, his first-year starter, these things happen. And the highest level, I mean, it was overtime. They got that far, dang it. So I'm really curious to see if he can continue to develop and continue to kind of create that magic that he does. Because I mean, I'm very curious to see how the recruiting pipeline is going to be at Alabama. I mean, it already is good. It's always going to be good. I mean, at least for the foreseeable future, because they have built an absolute machine there. But if they can absolutely get the most out of him, if they can get him a chance to take that next level and be the true dual threat weapon he is, I'm absolutely curious to see that because. Again, it's an SEC schedule. He's going to get tested. He's going to get plenty of opportunities. That Wisconsin game early on is going to be an absolute I mean, it's going to be a must-watch for me, but I recommend the rest of you get a chance to see that. I believe it's, next week? I think it's week 2. But what do you think? I mean, is that one of the most interesting kind of coach QB kind of gosh, I'm not going to make a Jedi reference. That's so nerdy. But, that kind of mentorship that we want to see there.
A master and Padawan sort of a relationship. Yeah. I think for me, I mean, look, I picked Jalen Milroe to win the Heisman Trophy, right? Like, I think that Kalen DeBoer is going to be able to unlock some things in his game that will really, really work for this team. I just think, and actually, I'm going to tie my next one in too, because it's a very similar situation in my mind. Texas A&M and this new staff, I'm fascinated to see a staff that's built on figuring things out. I think that in the SEC over the past 10 years, 15 years or so, because of Nick Saban, teams were ultra structured. Like, they just wanted structure. We do things this way. You figure it out. You fit into this hole. This is what you do because this is how you build a championship team. And now I think that Nick Saban kind of has his own way of doing that, where we're still going to maximize what you do well in a lot of ways. I think that other coaching staffs, Jimbo Fisher's being a chief among them, I think when you look at some of what Will Muschamp has done, like when you look at some of the more failed coaches from the Saban tree especially, it's fit into this hole. And now we're getting the opposite of that with Kalen DeBoer, who came up from the NAIA level, who came up, of course, from first Indiana, then Fresno State, now Washington, then Alabama. Like this is a coach who's made a career on just saying, what can we do and can we figure it out? Texas A&M, very similar situation. Mike Elko goes to Duke in year 1 with a roster that frankly was not all that good, wins 9 games because he's just like, how can we figure this out? They hire an offensive coordinator in Colin Klein, who is just an ultimate figure-it-out guy after his 2 years at Kansas State. He was not afraid to use drop-back passing, was not afraid to use the quarterback running game. So I think that, you look at these two staffs, I think this is going to be the future of the SEC. Teams that know how to acquire talent are able to do so, also augmented by NIL, and then create a roster that they can just figure out. Because that, to me, is what great coaches do these days. And I think that Kalen DeBoer and Mike Elko are chief on that list right now.
I think that's a great way to look at it. I think We're going to get a good opportunity to see how things are working out against a tough opponent in week one with that excellent matchup with Notre Dame. It's going to learn a lot about Notre Dame in that game too, especially if 6 total starts among your offensive line is enough to maintain a playoff run in this 12-team playoff era. I like that one. Well, when we come back from the break, we're going to take a look at 5 more of the big storylines we are looking forward to here in the 2024 season on the College Football Survivor Show. Okay, so here's one of the ones that I proposed, and I always, while I don't like rooting for people to lose their jobs, my goodness, does it get entertaining. It gets absolutely entertaining, especially and there's one thing for the coaches who go into the season with a seat on the hot seat, and as we watch it literally turn into a seat of flames by midseason or maybe even a few games in. But we're not talking about Florida right now. We're talking about which seemingly safe coach is going to suddenly end up on the hot seat by midseason. To me, that's one thing I'm always watching. Now, I'm not expecting some of the very, very top teams, unless things really go so unexpected, we're going to talk about it for generations. I mean, it's usually those teams that are kind of in that mid-tier who you expect, like, oh, it's a promising season. Maybe you might not make the playoff, but no problem. And then things go really bad. Who do we think? I mean, and I'm not saying who do we think, but I mean, is that something that you look forward to, or is that? Do you have? I mean, we don't necessarily have to name names. I mean, we talked a little bit about teams that could have their seasons go off the rails. We certainly talked about those in our last episode, but. What do you think of that? Is that something you look forward to in the season, or you find interesting at the very least?
Yeah, I mean, it's movement, right? Like, it just changes the way that you view these things. And I think what's so interesting about college football is that because of recruiting, perception becomes reality, right? Like, we're in a situation where when a guy starts to lose the support of the fan base, support of the team, it can spiral really, really fast. And like you said, I don't think you ever want to be in a situation where you're rooting for guys to lose their jobs necessarily. But I think that any coach would tell you it's a reality of the industry. When you get hired, you're probably going to get fired at some point. That's just, I think, how it all works. And look, I think that you're being a little. I think you're being a little too polite. I think that we can start to think a little bit about some of the coaches who might be able to come up and end up in more hot seat territory by the end of the year. Now, I will say some are obvious, right? Like Sam Pittman, he's on the hot seat, right? Billy Napier, Clark Lee, they're on the hot seat. Dave Aranda, he's on the hot seat. These aren't necessarily surprises. One that I'll say, I'm actually looking at Dennis Dodd CBS Sports hot seat ratings for every coach in the country right now. One who came into the year rated a 0 on the hot seat ratings was Mike Norvell. Now, Mike Norvell not going to end up on the hot seat. I feel very confident personally saying that. But like, that was not the way you want to start your follow-up, right? You don't want to lose to Georgia Tech in your first moment as a 0 rating hot seat coach. That's just playing with fire. So I would say after week 0, he moves from a 0 rating. I'd probably put him, 0 means untouchable, by the way. 1 is safe and secure. I think he moves up to a 1 now. He is back up to like, oh, okay, you're like normal. Your normal levels of cool seat. You're not one of the top 13 on the untouchable tier necessarily.
I like that. It's interesting too, because I think, at best Norvell would get to warm. That's the most I could see, and it would have to get pretty bad, I think, to reach there. The only reason I bring it up is the example that pops to mind is 2022 Wisconsin. Paul Chryst getting fired, early in the middle of the season. That came out of nowhere, especially considering the success he'd had in keeping Wisconsin a power. I mean, he wasn't quite necessarily at the Barry Alvarez towards the end of his career, but it was still a strong Wisconsin program. And that one I know shocked everyone. And of course, they ended up getting a heck of a hire. I mean, pulling Cincy's coach after that playoff run was absolutely astonishing. And we'll see how Fickell kind of develops out. But, so that's what I'm kind of looking out for. Are we going to get something where you're like out of left field, like, whoa, they were looking to go in another direction? Maybe the best way to look at it is which key athletic director hires have occurred in the last year or two. Now, I'm not saying Ohio State. I don't expect, I don't expect them to suddenly pull the plug on that. But I mean, there might be that kind of a question out there. That's always an interesting sign in and of itself. But
yeah, a couple that I'm just gonna bring up. And I really, first of all, like both of these coaches, but I think that their situations could get real interesting real fast. Sonny Dykes at TCU. He took his team to the national championship in year one, actually entered last year as a 0 on the hot seat. Dennis rates him as a 1 now. I tend to agree with that. I think he's going to get the chance to figure it out. But, like, what if they miss a bowl again? What if they are just, like, really, really bad again? I don't expect it. And also, even if they did go 5-7 again, I think he'd get at least another year to try to figure this thing out. We don't know his contract situation just because he's at TCU. But that's sort of like a way out of left field situation that I think could get kind of interesting. And again, I'm trying to go really off board here, right? Like, these aren't things that I think have much chance of happening. I'm looking a little interestingly at the Marcus Freeman thing. Because, like, they win 10 games last year, but they weren't very good. They've ended up ranked much lower than they started each of the past few years. They go on the road to Texas A&M. I think that Texas A&M is going to win that game. What if they win that game by a lot, right? Like, what if it's a 14-point win for Texas A&M against Notre Dame? And, like, what if they lose a weird upset game against Purdue and they start 1-2 and things just don't feel like they're heading right? This is literally just like one of the more insane things that I feel like I could try to pull out. But, like, I'm going to be curious exactly how much patience they have with him. I don't think that there's, short of them going like 3-9 this year, I don't think that there's a pathway to certainly him being let go after this season. But I think the pressure could start to mount just a little bit if they go 8-4, 9-3, and miss the college football playoff, and it just doesn't look like this team is all that special anymore.
Yeah, there's one other variation here. I'm curious to see if it could play out, because last season we saw Mississippi State try to make a go with Zach Arnett. Obviously, there was a reason for that. There was a tragic loss of Mike Leach in the offseason. But then it didn't work out. They had a decent enough contract where they were able to pull the cord after 10 games and then kind of move in a different direction. And obviously, they now have Levy as their head coach. But I wonder, and I've wondered this ever since Chip Kelly left. Deshaun Foster was a feel-good hire. He's obviously was a star player there as running back. I remember when he played for the Bruins. But no experience other than being a positions coach. If things start to go south, because again, I go, it's just UCLA. Well, it was just, quote unquote, just Mississippi State, not an SEC power we're talking about here. Could UCLA, as they enter the Big Ten, suddenly go, if things really start to look ugly really fast, could they go like, oh, maybe we were a little too optimistic here, and then you have an offensive coordinator in Eric Bieniemy, a guy who was a head coach candidate for many teams in the past, who had been a nice run in the NFL. I do wonder if they've structured that Deshaun Foster contract, because they were in the power in that situation. The employer was a little more powerful here because you weren't bringing like a superstar coach who could have his super agent kind of push you on all these things. You weren't getting yourself into a Kansas situation with, oh my gosh, what's his name? The former Notre Dame coach. Help me here. Charlie White. I get something of the Charlie White situation here. But I would be curious if we have a variant of that in with one of the newer head coaches at some of these programs. But I think we've talked enough about doom and gloom. What's one of the other things you're looking?
I'll tell you what, though, just real quick on UCLA. They go to the islands this week. That's going to obviously be interesting. Then Indiana, who I think that they could easily lose to, at LSU versus Oregon at Penn State. So, like, there's a very, very realistic pathway to being 1-4 and like completely not just out of like even looking like a team that can make a bowl. Like, there's absolutely a pathway to that. And I'm going to be very curious with UCLA's athletic director, Martin Jarmont, who I think is a really bright guy. And I think understood what he was doing, bringing in Deshaun Foster. And I think the reason that I don't think that he probably will get fired in the next couple of years is because I think that they understand we got to get the program right to kind of hire our next guy. And if Deshaun Foster works, great, but that's not really the point. But I mean, they won 8 games last year. I feel like we forget that because of how it ended. But like, they won 8 games. They could easily be a 3-win team this year, and I'm just going to be real curious to see how they handle that. Yeah, let's move a little bit to the happier side of these things. I want to see. Actually, I don't know exactly how happy this topic is. It's more interesting to me. So we've had a major realignment in college football over the past 3 years, and I am so interested to see in an SEC, especially where 9 of 16 teams have won a national championship since 1998, and in a Big Ten West where you had this gravy train to the Big Ten title game for all these years, and in a Big 12 where there were opportunities and teams now coming over from the Pac-12 that are used to competing in, for example, the Pac-12 South. I am so curious to see now teams that are used to contending and competing at the highest level. I'll actually mention, too, the former G5 teams that moved over to the Big 12 last year, Cincinnati, UCF, Houston, BYU, all of whom have been 10-win teams very recently. I'm so fascinated to see how everybody gets used to and adjusts to going from a team that's competing for the conference, or at least a conference championship game, to being one that's like, 7 wins. Nice year. Let's go to the Independence Bowl. Like, because it's going to be better programs than you think doing this. I mentioned the Big 12 teams that added to the league last year. Cincinnati was in the playoff in 2021, right? 2021, they were in the college football playoff. They missed a bowl last year. Houston, a couple years before that, 12-2, right? Like, really, really, really good team. They went 3-9 last year, right? Like, I think you look, especially in the SEC, this is where we're going to see the biggest brands have to deal with this new reality. I'm looking at, especially in the next couple of years, Florida and Auburn. Like, are you in trouble? Right? These are 2 teams that in the past 15 years have both won national championships, both made multiple SEC championship games over the past 10 to 15 years. I don't know. Are you in trouble? Are these programs in trouble, not just for this year, but the next 5 to 10 years too? I think that this first season is going to do a lot to just kind of set the tone of what to expect over the next couple of years, because the reality is, in the SEC, I mean, just to go through it, right? Like, you have Alabama, you have Georgia, you have Texas with the way that they're playing right now. We'll see, obviously, if they're able to keep it up. LSU, very recent national champion. Ole Miss, of course, under Lane Kiffin. They've been a 10-11 win team. Oklahoma, one of the most fascinating teams probably in this whole exercise to me. A blue blood program that's won the Big 12 more times than they lost the Big 12 as members of that conference. All of a sudden, some of these really good teams who might still be top 20 in the country are going to finish 8th in their conference. How do teams adjust to that new reality? And also for fans, how do they adjust to that new reality? Do they say, well, I think a really interesting example of this is South Carolina. South Carolina won 10 games twice with Steve Spurrier as their head coach, have not done anything close to that since then, almost in like their entire time in the SEC. But like, there's this expectation of like, well, we should be better. We should be Clemson. Like, how do you, as a program, as a fan base, adjust to that new reality? I'll say in the Big Ten too, Wisconsin has been that team. Iowa has been that team. How do these teams respond to that?
You know, you got me thinking, because the Oklahoma thing is very intriguing, only because they were such a dominating force in their old conference and in college football, in conferences, really. Let's be clear. I mean, the Big Eight in the era back in those days. But I'm now, even though these two fan bases have kind of gotten on each other's nerves, mostly because one poached the other's coach, Oklahoma and USC kind of feel like they're in that same boat, you know? I mean, because USC was the creme de la creme of the Pac-12 back in the day. In the Pac, I mean, they used to call the Pac-8 USC and the Seven Dwarfs. That there was an era where it was just kind of a ridiculous one-sided affair. But now they're in the Big Ten, just like the Oklahomas in the SEC, and obviously USC and UCLA kicked off the break apart of the Pac-12. But then with Oregon, with Washington, and Washington's also in this, but Washington, while it has been obviously a successful team and the runner-up this last season and has a couple of national championships to their name, not quite the level of USC, but they now have been a little overshadowed by Oregon, which seems to have actually prepared for this kind of a move, as it turns out. So I'm wondering how that looks. I mean, especially in the next 5 to 10 years, I'm very curious to see USC and Oklahoma, how they do in this new reality. Can they climb up, or are we going to see them have to deal with going from being an A team to a B team, or maybe even a C team in their conference? I'm very curious to see that. I think B team is realistic for both of them, like a second tier team, like that occasionally punches for the top, but is that going to be something that fan bases can be comfortable with from what they were used to before? And granted, USC has not been that good for the last 15 years. I'm not saying this isn't the Pete Carroll era. There's been a lot of time in between, but expectations can stay at that level. And can things adjust? Or I'm not sure. I mean, how do we think Nebraska fans adjusted? Because they went from being, I still remember when Nebraska was an absolute terror to sort of turning into, hey, they might finally go to a bowl again this season. Can they deal with that? Because also Nebraska fans are nice. Maybe that's the other thing. But I don't know. Oklahoma and USC fans, how are they going to deal with that?
Yeah. I mean, I think like with USC, the answer is probably just that people stop caring, right? Like Nebraska fans and Oklahoma fans too, they just show up week after week, month after month, year after year. They're not going to stop showing up. That's just the kind of fans that they are. USC fans are not like that. They'll just be like, all right, time to go watch LeBron instead. Time to go watch Ohtani instead. Or just like,
let's go to the beach.
Yeah, just go to the beach. Like they're just going to not show up. That's the reality of the situation, right? And I think that people have told me before that, like, because I've made a comment along the lines of like, well, I think that television decisions have actually led to realignment and lack of interest. And like, you have to be careful. Like if you keep consolidating, that eventually we're going to end up in a point where you lose interest in the sport. People are like, no, people will always watch. Well, the reality is I think that you look at the West Coast and the way that at times they were marginalized, especially with lack of television access because of the Pac-12 network, and people stopped watching and didn't think twice about it. There's going to be some places, like people are going to stop watching in Birmingham or Columbus, Ohio, but people might stop watching. I mean, actually, I think like it'll be fascinating in Dallas or Houston, right? Where it's like these are pro sports markets too. Maybe it goes from being a top priority for you to watch to a priority for you to watch. That's the sort of thing that I think you run into if you consolidate too much. And if you have some of these programs start to fall by the wayside. So I'm fascinated. I don't know. It's really, really interesting to try to understand some of this. I think even actually when you talk about fans losing interest and moving off, that's a big issue that the U.S. had. Right, that's a big reason why Miami is not really a national power anymore. It's because people watch pro sports or go to the beach instead. They don't just stick around and watch college football. So it's a lot to try to figure out, and I am fascinated to see how they deal with it.
I love you brought up Miami because I've always felt that Miami and USC are very similar in a lot of regards. Private universities.
You got to throw SMU into here, man. You got to throw your fellow coach.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, they are recovering. They are because I mean maybe pre-80s SMU before they kind of blew it all up. They're coming back. They're coming back.
Cowboys really came to town. That's the real issue.
Yeah, but I mean, it's absolutely fascinating to watch the reactions of the Miami Hurricanes and USC Trojans fans because it's very similar. They have core fans. But then they have kind of fans that are on that second level that they can be awakened, but only if the team's doing really well. And, you got that turnover chain and all that stuff. Got to bring it back. Bring back the turnover chain, dang it. Started all the chaos, all the silliness on the sidelines, which I love. It's college football, dang it. But this is a good kind of transition to my next one, which is which team is going to unexpectedly rise this season? Because that's always something. We talked about that because we made our forecast for the 12-team playoff. Both of us did that, fairly similar. But at the same time, we acknowledge that there's going to be some team that is going to rise. Maybe how's it going to rise? It's going to be a mix of talent, maybe players rising up who we thought they could be good, but now they suddenly hit their mark. Is it going to be like a coaching change? Is it going to be the coach is finally getting them, maybe not necessarily the head coach or one of these many coordinator changes that we talked about again in a previous episode? Go back and listen if you get a chance. Or is it a favorable schedule that suddenly sets up a team that makes a real run and just the things break just right to get them into that playoff, and suddenly they become the excitement of the 12-team playoff? I mean, that is something I'm looking forward to. I mean, obviously there's some teams we've talked about schedule-wise that seem to have some favorable ones there. I mean, Iowa is one that we've talked about from the Big Ten. Rutgers is my secondary favorite, but I'm not going to push that one too hard. Mizzou, obviously, they've got talent, but they've also got a great schedule if they can make a run of that. I mean, for all the questions we've had on Notre Dame, they also have a great schedule, so it could very well turn out to be
a very easy schedule.
Yeah, so they could easily get into that 12-team playoff. So I'm curious to see that. Or will it be a team that maybe has a mid-range schedule, but just some guys just click, and we've seen that. I mean, that's how 2 seasons ago USC was a sort of an in-game gimpy leg of Caleb Williams from making their way into the 14 playoff. I mean, sometimes that happens, and they probably would have absolutely been obliterated in the playoff, but we knew that suddenly they were getting that far based on suddenly a player just rose. So, I mean, it's hard to predict. I'm not saying and I know, Sean, you probably have some ideas of maybe some teams that could be that, but I mean, I'm always fascinated. That is one of the storylines because those are some of the most exciting ones, especially mid-season when that team has not lost yet and they actually look pretty good. I mean, maybe it's Georgia Tech this season. I mean, I don't want to give too much on their shoulders, but their coach can carry it. He's a big guy, but there's some opportunities there to see who's going to be the next big thing.
No, and I think for me, right, I mentioned Texas A&M with a coaching staff change. I think this is a team that easily could find a way to play their way up. I think Tennessee is a really interesting one, too, with Nico taking over at quarterback. I think the fact that they were able to win 9 games the last year with some of the offensive issues and injuries that they had, that is a huge, huge deal to me. I think I just think that it's like such an upgrade for them to bring in some of the guys that they're going to be bringing back on offense. Also, by the way, Brew McCoy coming back, who I think that I saw a story where Nico was like, that's the guy who I looked up to growing up. And it's like, he's just still in college football because he's been around for so dang long. I'm curious to see. I don't want to overvalue too much, but like Aiden Childs going to Michigan State is so interesting. Like that is, I don't think that they're going to be all that good. I think that they probably like best case scenario are a 5-7 or something like that. But he's really good. He is a lot of fun. They're going to be scheming up something around him just to get him really in the best situations that they can find. I think that he is a potential breakout candidate. So maybe Michigan State is a team that goes from, hey, being picked last place in the conference to, oh, this team ended up going 12th out of 17 or 11th out of 17. I think that I could definitely see something like that happening. I've beaten the Iowa State drum all offseason long between their coaching and their quarterback, Rocco Becht. I think that they have a chance to be pretty special. I'm trying to think, again, NC State I feel like is too much of a contender in our mind to count as a come-from-behind type team. But I do want to think of another ACC team. I mean, does anybody...
Syracuse? I mean, do we think Syracuse could get something going there?
That's true. They have in Kyle McCord, like, he is... I'm trying to think of the last most talented quarterback to come through Syracuse, right? Like, obviously, you're not going all the way back to McNabb or anything like that, but, like... it's been a few years since they've had a really, really talented quarterback who was able to go out and win games for them. Ryan Nassib might be kind of the last one from that talent perspective that you could point to. But I think that McCord, he wasn't able to do what Ohio State needed him to do. but that doesn't mean that he's a bad football player. I was actually having this conversation because I'm working on a story that I'm excited to talk about a little bit more in the coming weeks, maybe pay attention week 2. But there are some guys who have left, and I've noticed especially the Texas ones for obvious reasons. But like, you look at Haynes King going to Georgia Tech and just being allowed to cook. Kyron Drones going from Baylor to Virginia Tech, just allowed to cook. Hudson Card going from Texas to Purdue. Cameron Rising, actually a great example of this, going to Utah a couple years ago. They're able to do things to leverage their talent at these schools, at maybe the second tier schools, that you're not allowed to when all eyes are on you at Texas or at Texas A&M or at Ohio State. Even I think you look at USC, I'm curious in a few years, we'll see if it's at Boise State, if Malachi Nelson is able to be that kind of player who just needed some time to grow into himself and then was ready to go. I think that Kyle McCord could be one of these players. He's got to play more confident. He has to be more aggressive, but he's going to be allowed to make mistakes at Syracuse in a way that he just was not allowed to at Ohio State, because Ohio State is Ohio freaking State.
You know, I just have to say the Brew McCoy thing, just going back to that, I'm totally imagining if he gets told, like, I grew up watching you, I hope Brew had the wherewithal to just kind of go, like, grab him by the hair and kind of tussle it up. Thanks, kid. You know what? You know, I know you have
the towel here, kid. Catch.
Catch. Like, going back to that. That's an older reference. I'm impressed.
Hey,
you know, I want
Green, man, right down the street from me. North Texas legend.
You know, I know you want to bring up the last one, so I'm going to go again and just bring up another thing I'm looking forward to. And this is looking at this playoff that's coming up. Because when we did our playoff previews, you know, I think both of us put in like 5 SEC teams. So can the ACC or Big 12 get a second team? I mean, or, like, not and, or
yes.
either of them get something other than their conference champion, which is going to get presumably one of the top 4 seeds into the 12-team playoff field. Is it possible? I mean, I think it would need a little bit of chaos perhaps in the SEC for that to work out, where they really start grinding each other like a classic Pac-12 conference, or maybe based on merits. I hate saying that. Florida State losing really kind of messed things up a little bit, although maybe not. If a team goes through the ACC and only loses the championship game to a Florida State, we might be in that kind of a scenario. But what do you think?
I think that there's a couple things. One, there is going to be so much focus on a handful of games and how they could impact the playoff cases for an ACC or Big 12 team as an at-large. To me, maybe one of the most consequential games in college football for the playoff will take place in week 2. Will take place in Charlotte, and that's NC State versus Tennessee. If NC State wins that game, they have a pathway at 11-2 to being an at-large team. Like, they just do, based on how good we think that Tennessee has a chance to be this year. Another one with that, one reason that I've said I think the Big 12 only gets one in, I think Iowa State's going to lose to Iowa. If Iowa State beats Iowa and they can be a 1 or 2 loss team from the Big 12 with that head-to-head over Iowa and the rest of their losses coming in conference, I think that team has a much better chance to get in. One other that I'll point out is West Virginia versus Penn State in week 1. If Penn State gets knocked off by West Virginia in week 1, West Virginia probably jumps up to the top 15. And that changes, one, the case for West Virginia and other Big 12 teams. It also makes Penn State's case worse because, by the way, I think we are unanimous in that we don't expect them to actually contend for the Big Ten. They're going to be fighting for an at-large spot. But, you know, if Penn State is the number 10 or 11 team in the country and West Virginia is there at 11-2 at the end of the year and they've got a head-to-head against Penn State, that changes everything. I think not just for West Virginia, but for the Big 12. So you need some of these teams, which I am projecting all 3 of the Big Ten and SEC teams to win those 3 games. I think Tennessee wins. I think Iowa wins. I think that Penn State wins. If any of those flip, I think that opens the door in a huge way for the Big 12 or ACC. So these first few weeks are going to be really, really important. And like you said, I think that it's a huge, and by the way, I'll throw Clemson, Georgia into there. Obviously, if they win that game, that's a huge deal. I don't expect that one. But I do think it's a huge deal that Florida State already has a conference loss on their record. That's a game that they won't be able to really get back somewhere else. And it makes their job trying to get in as an at-large team much more difficult than it would have been just a couple of weeks ago.
I think this actually really blends well into the final point, the one you want to make. And what is the thing you are looking forward to close us out this upcoming season?
We're the College Football Survivor Show. We talk about the College Football Playoff, of course, every single week. And I am fascinated and frankly excited about how coverage of college football and watching of college football changes in the 12-team college football playoff. And what I mean by that is most years heading into November, we're talking like 9 teams who have a chance to make the top 4, maybe less. Well, now all of a sudden we're in a situation where heading into the month of November, there'll be like 35 teams that are either competitive in conference championship races, are competitive for the group of 5 spots, potentially as conference champions, that have a chance to earn a bye, that have a chance to earn an at-large. There will be so many teams involved down the stretch, and I think we've already seen some of this with the amount of coverage outside of course, we've talked about these teams all year, for years and years, but the amount of coverage that group of 5 teams have gotten on other mainstream platforms, I think, has transformed tremendously. We've seen features about Memphis and Boise State come out, or Tulane, or App State. Like, we've already seen stories that I don't think would have been told in previous years because these teams weren't quote unquote relevant for the playoff. That's huge to me. And I think that if we head into November and we've got 25 teams that have a chance to make the college football playoff, I am so excited to get to watch, on CBS or on ESPN or on Fox, a great feature on NC State, right? I'm so excited to get to read a long form feature that maybe I can get greenlit at CBS Sports on like UTSA, right? Like, I think that it just changes the way that we're going to be able to watch the sport and cover the sport and consume the sport in a way that I think, frankly, just aligns better with my interests and my values of the sport. I know that some people talked about after the game, like, oh, this sucks. In previous years, Florida State would have just been done, but now the regular season's not valuable anymore. And it's like, what you are proposing is the idea that Florida State's 11 games should just be irrelevant. That, like, they shouldn't matter to the actual sports. Like what makes the regular season less valuable than it being over by August 24th for a major brand in this sports? It doesn't make any sense to me. And the other piece of this too, by the way, when we talk about the most valuable brands in the sport, is that they already haven't had the same onus to have a valuable regular season as other teams. Alabama lost to Texas in week 2, made the playoff anyway over an undefeated team. Back in 2014, right? The way that we kicked this system off was Ohio State lost to a Virginia Tech team that went 6-6 and made the playoff anyway. Like, the regular season has only been damaging to a certain number of teams in the past. The big boys have gotten through regardless. Mm-hmm. And now I'm excited about the fact that we are going to get to see teams grow and develop over the course of the year. That we're going to get to see teams get their shot at the end of the year. I think to a team like 2022 Kansas State, who by the end of the year, well, I mean, they were playing as well or better than TCU was and win that Big 12 title game, and they would have been in the college football playoff. I think that's great. I think that that's how this sport should work, and I'm excited to see more of the things that I think should be valuable, like conference championships, like improving, like playing your way in, be valued in a different way in the 12-team college football playoff than we saw in the 14 playoff.
I completely agree with you. I mean, I think there was a bit of stagnation that was occurring in the sport, and particularly among the perception of fans, particularly, I mean, really both the more intense hardcore fans as well as the casual fans, that things had gotten, oh wow, it's Alabama Clemson again. It's like or seeing maybe a Georgia and Ohio State mixed in there. While some people thought this is the nature of things, this is how it should be. It was not helping the sport, and it was quite honestly getting a little stale. We were lucky in that the last couple of seasons we saw some exciting storylines. I mean, really going back to Cincy making it into the playoff, but also TCU going on wild. The poster child for where did that come from, going all the way to be the runner-up. And then last season seeing a Michigan team that hadn't been around for a while playing a Washington team, both of which were not necessarily, especially with Washington, expected to make it all the way. And this 12-team playoff is only going to make it more exciting with more possibilities, more teams, and quite frankly, more things to talk about all the way in the end of the season. I mean, I cannot wait to see how intense, how different it's going to feel when we get to late November, mid-November, and so many teams are really kind of contending. And an upset of the 11th ranked or 10th ranked team could really make a difference suddenly. And when we're talking about who's going to be in and who's going to be out, I can't wait. It's so exciting. This is, again, those are just 10 of the storylines. There are many more possibilities out there. If you have your own, hey, send it to us. We'd love to hear it. But I'm going to go ahead and thank all of you all for listening here. I want to thank our producer, Joey Aliberti, for making us sound great. Be sure to like, rate, and subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. You can find us on X and TikTok at CFB Survivor Show. He's Shehan Jayaraja. You can find his work at CBSSports.com and at Shehan Jayaraja on X and TikTok. I'm Bobak Hayeri, part of the team that runs Reddit CFB. Thanks for listening, everyone. Have a great one.
The College Football Survivor Show, where playoff survival is always on the line.